The breakfast dishes were drying in the rack. The lawn was trimmed, the mortgage paid that month, the family in their pew every Sunday by every outward sign, the most ordinary house on the street. And on a November morning in 1971, the father of that house walked from room to room and shot all 5 people in it one by one, his wife, his mother, his 3 children. Then he tidied the bodies, set hymns playing over the intercom, and vanished so cleanly that no one would find them for a month or find him for 18 years. To everyone who knew him, John List was the last man on earth you would picture doing such a thing. He was a church-going Lutheran, a Sunday school teacher, a scout leader, an accountant, precise, formal button to the collar. He lived with his wife, his 3 children, and his elderly mother in a grand Victorian mansion in Westfield, New Jersey. 19 rooms, a ballroom, a stained glass skylight overhead. From the outside, the Lists looked like the American dream, with the corners squared off. John worked hard, prayed hard, and ran his household by strict and rigid rules. His wife Helen was quietly unwell, worn down by a chronic illness. His mother Alma lived upstairs on the 3rd floor, her savings within his reach. The children moved through a home governed by a stiff, joyless discipline. He was by every visible measure a model of respectability. That it turned out was the whole problem. Respectability was the thing he guarded above all else, above in the end the lives of the people it was supposed to describe. Because by the autumn of 1971, the respectable life was already a lie, just not yet a violent one. List had lost his job months earlier, and he could not bring himself to tell his family. He couldn't face the shame. So he kept up the performance. Every morning he put on his suit, took up his briefcase, and left the house as if going to work, then sat at the train station reading the newspaper, riding out the hours. To cover the mortgage on a house he could no longer afford, he quietly drained his elderly mother's savings. The bills were mounting. The money was nearly gone. And the gap between the life he projected and the life he actually had was becoming unbearable to him. He had built his entire identity on appearances. When the appearances could no longer be maintained, something had to give, and he had already decided somewhere inside that it would not be the appearances. On November 9th, he acted. While the house was quiet, he shot his wife, Helen. He shot his mother, Alma, 84 years old, in her room on the 3rd floor. Then he waited. The 2 younger children came home from school. His eldest son returned last from a soccer game, and of all of them he was the one who fought. For him it was neither quick nor easy. By the time the house fell silent again, Patricia, 16, John, 15, and Frederick, 13, were dead with the rest. Then List laid the bodies out unhurried and sat down to write. The letter he left ran 5 pages addressed to his pastor. And it is the most revealing thing in the entire case, because it is not the raving of a man who has lost his mind. It is orderly, reasoned, almost serene. He has explained that he had killed his family out of love. The world, he wrote, was sliding into sin. The money was gone. The family's good name was at risk. His children might drift from their faith. So he had sent them all to heaven now, while their souls were still safe, rather than let them face shame and temptation here on earth. Read that again. He had murdered the people he loved in his own telling, in order to protect them and to protect above everything the idea of the family he had always presented to the world. The respectability was not just his cover story. In his own mind, it was his reason. And the smallness of it is the chilling part. Among the worries he set down was that his teenage daughter had grown interested in acting, which he regarded as a doorway to sin. This was a man prepared to kill his own children, rather than watch them become people he disapproved of, and then to file the act under love. There is no rage in the letter, only the cold arithmetic of a man weighing his family's souls against his own collapsing pride and deciding the sums came out in his favor. Then he disappeared, with the same cold competence he brought to a ledger. He had thought it through. He canceled the milk, the mail, the newspaper, so nothing would pile up on the porch and raise an alarm. He left the lights burning throughout the house. He put music playing over the home intercom so the rooms would not feel empty. He turned the heat down low. Everything was arranged so the bodies would lie undiscovered as long as possible while he got a head start. It worked. He drove to the airport, abandoned his car, and walked out of his old life. Nearly a month passed before a neighbor, unsettled by lights that never went dark and a house that never stirred, finally called the police, who entered to find organ music still drifting through the empty rooms. Inside the grand ballroom, they found Helen and the 3 children laid out in a row. The heat turned low to slow what the cold could slow. Alma was upstairs where she had died. The house had been kept like a tomb, and the music had played on over the dead for almost a month, while the man who left it behind built a new life somewhere else. Here is the part that defines John List, and the reason his story opens this video. Most people who do something like this fall apart afterward. They run to the margins or unravel or turn the gun on themselves. List did none of that. He moved to Colorado, took a new name, Robert Clark, and calmly, methodically rebuilt the exact same life he had just destroyed. He settled first in Denver, later in Virginia. He found work as an accountant, joined a Lutheran congregation, and in time married a woman named Dolores, who knew him only as the mild, devout Robert Clark, a man with an unremarkable past. He became all over again the quiet, respectable, church-going family man. Sit with what that means. The respectable life was never a costume he pulled on over the real John List. It was the real John List, or the only version of himself he could stand to be. He had killed 5 people to keep that image intact, and then he simply carried the image off to a new state and stood it back up as though the family beneath it had been incidental all along. For 18 years it held. No one looked twice at the polite accountant in the 3rd pew. What finally undid him was not a detective. The case had gone cold for the better part of 2 decades. The police had all but given up. What got him was television. In 1989, the program America's Most Wanted ran the story, and to tell it, they hired a sculptor to build a bust of what List might look like after 18 years of aging. They put that aged face on the screen, and a former neighbor recognized it. The sculptor Frank Bender had even guessed at the heavier jaw and the kind of glasses List would likely be wearing by then. The resemblance was uncanny. A woman who had once lived near him saw the bust and called. The tip led to a respectable accountant in Virginia named Robert Clark, who, when agents came, calmly denied being John List until fingerprints taken decades earlier ended the performance for good. Think about how that capture actually worked. Not through his crimes leaving a trail. through his face. The mask had hidden him perfectly for 18 years, precisely because it was so ordinary, so unremarkable, so unthreatening, that no one ever had a reason to look behind it. In the end, the only thing that gave him away was that ordinary face finally shown to enough people at once. The most dangerous man in that quiet suburb had always been the one who looked the least like a danger, and that is the quiet lesson under the whole story. We extend our trust to the people who look the part: the churchgoer, the family man, the man in the good suit. And then we stop looking. Respectability is not proof of anything. It is just a costume we have agreed not to question. List wore it for 46 years before the murders, and 18 years after, and almost no one ever thought to check what was underneath. John List was returned to New Jersey convicted of 5 murders and sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms. He died in prison in 2008. To the end, he maintained that he expected to be reunited with his family in heaven forgiven. But the family he claimed to be saving were people not symbols: Helen, his wife; Alma, his mother; and his 3 children among them. Patricia, 16, who had dreamed of being an actress, a dream her father judged sinful and forbade, and who, in the months before she died, had quietly confided to someone that she was afraid of him. He killed them by his own account to protect a family's good name. But the family was the price he paid, not the thing he saved. What he was really protecting was an image of himself, and he was willing to empty the house of every living person in it rather than admit even once that the image had never been true. A thought from me before the next one, Johnson here. John List fooled the people closest to him: a wife, 3 children, a congregation that knew his face. His mask only had to hold for the few dozen people who looked at him each day. The next man wore the same kind of mask: the churchgoer, the family man, the helpful neighbor. But he wore it in front of an entire city for 3 decades, while that city was actively, desperately hunting for him. He was president of his church council. He led a Cub Scout pack. He was the local code enforcement officer, the man who would measure your lawn and write you up if the grass grew too long. His neighbors in Wichita trusted Dennis Rader for decades. They had no idea they already knew his other name. He had mailed it to the police himself years before, tucked inside letters that bragged about the people he had strangled, BTK, bind, torture, kill. There is almost nothing about Dennis Rader's outward life that would make you look twice. He was a married father of 2 in Park City, a suburb of Wichita, Kansas. He attended Christ Lutheran Church, where the congregation eventually elected him president. He had been a Cub Scout leader. He held a dull, petty little job, enforcing city ordinances, checking that dogs were leashed and lawns were trimmed, writing up neighbors whose grass grew too high. He earned a college degree at night and went to football games on Saturdays. He was in every way the eye could measure the most unremarkable man on his street. His own wife and children lived beside him for decades and never saw a flicker of anything else. And that ordinariness was not incidental to what he did. It was the engine of it, because behind it for years, Dennis Rader was the killer who had an entire city terrified. It began in January 1974, when he forced his way into a home in Wichita and murdered 4 members of the Otero family, Joseph and Julie, the parents, and 2 of their children, 11-year-old Josephine and 9-year-old Joseph Jr. It was the Otero's 15-year-old son, Charlie, who came home from school that afternoon and found them. Over the years that followed, he killed others, mostly women chosen and watched, and then attacked in their own homes. 10 people in all. And each time he would do what he had come to do, and then he would drive back to his own house, to his wife and his kids and his church, and become the ordinary man again. There was no transformation, no visible seam. He simply changed his clothes. That seamlessness is the hardest thing for people to believe and the most important thing to understand about him. There was no tormented double life in the movie sense, no man torn apart by what he was. Rader could lead a scout meeting on a Saturday and stalk a victim the same week and feel no friction between the two. He kept the killer in a sealed compartment, opened it when he wanted, and shut it again. The ordinary man was not a costume worn over the monster. They lived in the same skin side by side comfortably. What set BTK apart from most killers, and what made him infamous, was that he wanted you to know. He named himself in a letter to a local newspaper after his own method: bind, torture, kill. And then he kept writing. For years, he sent letters, puzzles, and drawings to the press and the police, taunting them, bragging, daring them to catch him. He left grisly souvenirs. He sent chillingly drawings of his crimes. He mailed his messages tucked into cereal boxes, a private little joke about the word cereal. He was not only a murderer, he was a performer who needed an audience, and the gulf between the dull compliance officer and the man who wrote those letters was to him the entire thrill, and that is what made him so nearly impossible to catch. The investigators who chased BTK for 3 decades kept circling the same unsettling idea: their man was probably completely normal. He was, as one observer put it at the time, the stranger beside you, a man who killed and then simply resumed his rightful place in the community, walking the same streets, sitting in the same pews. Nobody hunts for a monster behind the man who runs the church council and tickets you for your lawn. Respectability was not a place he hid after the crimes. It was the disguise that let him commit them and keep walking. Then after 1991, the letters stopped. BTK went silent. The case went cold, and the ordinary man simply kept being ordinary for more than a decade. For Wichita, BTK was a wound that would not close. Parents checked the locks twice. A whole generation grew up knowing those 3 letters. Police built and rebuilt task forces, ran down thousands of tips, and got nowhere because there was nothing unusual to find. Or rather, because everything about him was usual, and you cannot pick one ordinary man out of a city full of them. He was a ghost. For exactly the reason he was so dangerous, he looked like everyone. Then in 2004, his ego woke back up. A local paper had run a piece marking the anniversary of the killings, wondering aloud whether BTK was dead or long gone. He could not let that stand. After 13 years of silence, he began writing again, even taking credit for a murder. No one had connected to him, and the same hunger to be seen that had driven the killing was about to destroy him. In early 2005, he sent the police a message with a simple question. If he saved something to a floppy disk and mailed it to them, could they trace it back to a computer? The police, who had failed to catch this man for 30 years, answered him through a classified newspaper notice. No, they told him. It's safe. It was a lie. He believed it because he believed he was smarter than they were. He saved a document onto a purple floppy disk and sent it in. Investigators recovered the deleted data hidden on it. The disk had last been used at Christ Lutheran Church by a user named Dennis. They looked up the church. The president of its congregation was a man named Dennis Rader. The mask did not slip. It typed its own name and mailed it to the police. From the moment that disk arrived, it took just 9 days. Surveillance turned up a black Jeep matching one seen near an earlier drop. To be certain, investigators quietly obtained DNA from a medical sample belonging to Rader's daughter. It came back a familial match to genetic material left under a victim's fingernails 3 decades before. On February 25, 2005, they arrested him. In the interrogation room, one of the things that seemed to gall him most was the trick with the disk. "How come you lied to me?" he asked the detective, as if after everything he had done, the real unfairness in the room were theirs. Sit with how cleanly that trap closed, because it is the whole point of his story. For 30 years, Rader's church and his community were the perfect cover. Nobody investigates the council president. Nobody profiles the man who measures your grass. The trust bought him decade after decade. And then that very same respectability, the church, the official title, the ordinary, traceable life, was the thread that reeled him in. The DNA and the arrest only confirmed what the disk had already delivered, a road straight to the one institution that had vouched for him the longest. He was not undone despite hiding in plain sight. He was undone because of it. The plainer the sight, the more of his ordinary findable self he had left lying everywhere. Dennis Rader pleaded guilty and will die in prison. When he finally stood in court and entered that plea, the country watched the two halves of him fuse into one. He described the murders in a flat, procedural monotone, calm, precise, almost clerical, as if reading from a maintenance log. He had a bureaucrat's vocabulary for the worst things a person can do. That toneless recitation, more than any single fact of the case, is what people remember, the dawning realization that the horror and the dull civic functionary had always been the same man, and that he could talk about the one in the ordinary voice of the other. His wife, married to him for more than 30 years, was granted an emergency divorce. His children were left to rebuild from nothing their understanding of their own father. But hold on to one image. When officers came to Christ Lutheran Church to tell the pastor that the council president, the man who had led their prayers, sat in their meetings, shaken their hands every Sunday, was BTK, the pastor had to ask them to repeat it 3 times before it would go in. He later said the world changed in that moment. That is the true horror of this kind of monster. The danger was never lurking at the edge of their lives. It had been standing at the front of the room. And the people who paid for his performance were real, and they were not his audience. They were a family in their own home in 1974, a mother, a father, and 2 children, 9 and 11 years old. And the victims who came after ordinary people killed by the most ordinary-seeming man any of them had ever met. He wanted more than almost anything to be remembered as BTK. They are the ones who deserve to be remembered as the people he took, not the legend he was trying to build. Johnson here, a quick pause before the last one, and it's the case that unsettles me most because of how high up it goes. If these are landing for you, a subscribe and a comment genuinely keep this channel running and tell me where to point it next. Okay? The Last Man. Because Dennis Rader hid among ordinary people as one of them, a face in the crowd you would never pick out. The Last Man did something a step further. He didn't blend into the community. He stood at the very top of it in a uniform a whole country had agreed meant safety, and turned everything that trust handed him into a tool. Case 3. Russell Williams. Ontario, Canada, 2010. The Protector. He flew the Queen of England. He commanded Canada's largest Air Force base, thousands of personnel, the jets that carried prime ministers and dignitaries, all answering to Colonel Russell Williams. If you wanted to picture the man a country trusts to protect it, you would picture him. He was also a serial rapist and a murderer. And the thing that finally caught one of the most powerful officers in the Canadian military was a set of tire tracks in the snow. Russell Williams was the respectable mask at its most imposing. He was an elite pilot with an immaculate record, educated at the country's best schools, decorated the kind of officer the military puts in front of cameras. He had flown VIP transport jets carrying the Prime Minister, visiting heads of state, and the Queen herself. He had commanded a base overseas. He was married for 18 years with no hint of trouble and no record of any kind. And in the summer of 2009, he was handed command of 8 Wing at Canadian Forces Base, Trenton, the largest Air Force base in the country, and the place through which Canada's fallen soldiers are carried home. Days before everything collapsed, he was photographed in his dress uniform beside the nation's top general and its defense minister. He was widely seen as a rising star, a man being groomed for the very highest ranks. There was quite literally no one in his world who suspected him of anything at all. That is the height from which this story falls. Because in private, Colonel Williams had been living another life entirely, and it had been escalating for years. It began with break-ins, dozens upon dozens of them, more than 80 over several years, slipping into the homes of women and girls near his weekend cottage in the small town of Tweed, and beyond, to steal their underwear and photograph himself. He documented all of it obsessively, thousands of images, meticulous inventories of what he had taken and where. He was a man who kept records of his own secret life the way he kept records of a flight. In time, the break-ins were not enough. They escalated to assaults. In the fall of 2009, within weeks of each other, he broke into 2 homes in Tweed and attacked the women he found there, blindfolded, terrified. One of them survived and would later speak publicly about the hours she spent certain she was going to die. And then it escalated once more to murder. That long ramp is its own kind of horror. For years, while a friendly colonel waved at his Tweed neighbors and rose through the ranks, a prowler had been violating homes across the same small communities, and no one connected the two because the two could not possibly be the same person. A man whose uniform was a standing promise of protection had become in the dark its precise opposite, one careful step at a time, and he chronicled every step. His 2 murder victims deserved to be named first before anything that was done to them. Corporal Marie-France Comeau was 38, an Air Force flight attendant, a member of the very military Williams commanded station at his own base, Jessica Lloyd was 27 from a small community near Belleville, Ontario. By every account of the people who loved her, she was warm, funny, and full of plans. These were not case numbers. One was a woman in uniform who trusted the chain of command he sat at the top of. The other was a young woman asleep in her own home. Both were killed by the man their country had decided was safe. Jessica Lloyd had bought a new home and a new car not long before she disappeared. A young woman building a life not winding one down. Her family searched and held out hope, and then had the unbearable truth delivered to them all at once. Afterward, her brother said the only thing he wanted in the world was for the man who took her to die behind bars. And this is where William's story becomes the sharpest version of everything in this video. Because for him, the respectable mask was not only a hiding place, it was a tool. When he targeted Marie-France Comeau in her home, investigators later concluded he had used his access to military information to learn her schedule, to know when she would be alone. He killed her, and in the days after, he carried on at the head of his base as though nothing had happened, and signing the paperwork, keeping the appointments, and wrote a letter of condolence to her grieving family, playing in ink the part of the commanding officer mourning one of his own. The performance never so much as flickered. And then there is the detail that once you have heard it, you cannot put back down. When Jessica Lloyd was reported missing, a search was launched across the area, and Colonel Williams, in his capacity as base commander, authorized one of his own base's aircraft to join the effort to find her. He sent the machinery of search and rescue out over the countryside to look for a woman whose body he himself had hidden because he was the one who had put it there. The protector personally ran the search for his own victim. There is no purer image of this entire idea the man trusted to find. The lost was the reason she was gone. Here is the part that should give everyone a strange kind of comfort. None of his powers saved him in the end, and nothing exotic brought him down. It was plain, patient police work. In the days after Lloyd vanished, officers ran a roadside canvass near her home, stopping cars, checking tires, taking notes in the cold. Someone matched a set of distinctive tire tracks left in the snow outside her house to the SUV driven by a local Air Force colonel. That was the thread. They asked Williams to come in on a Sunday for what looked like a routine interview. What followed has become one of the most studied interrogations ever recorded. There was no shouting, no theatrics. A single Detective Sergeant Jim Smith sat across from the colonel and calmly and methodically laid out the case, telling him almost gently that the evidence was already overwhelming the tire tracks, the boot prints, the DNA on its way, and that the only real question left was what kind of man Williams wanted to be in the minutes ahead. It went on for the better part of 10 hours, and over that time the most powerful man in the room slowly came apart. What is most chilling on the tape is what seemed to trouble him, as he broke not the lives he had taken, but how the whole thing was going to look. The embarrassment, the impact on his reputation, on his wife. In the end, his rank and his record bought him nothing. He confessed, and he drew the police a map to Jessica Lloyd's body. When investigators then searched his homes, they found the rest of it a staggering private archive of thousands of photographs and videos in which Williams had recorded his own crimes step by step beside neat catalogs of everything he had stolen. He had built a museum of himself. The man who saluted the flag by day had spent his nights documenting with a clerk's care everything the uniform was supposed to stand against. Now stand back and look at all three of these men together. John List hid behind the trust of a family. Dennis Rader hid behind the trust of a town and a church. Russell Williams hid behind the trust of an entire nation. And his case shows the final sharpest truth of the three, because for him that trust was never only camouflage. It was a set of keys to schedules, to bases, to aircraft, to the benefit of every conceivable doubt. The more we trust a man, the more we hand him, and the less it ever occurs to us to check. And in Williams' case, trust did not merely fail to catch him. It armed him. The schedule that told him when a colleague would be alone. The aircraft he was able to send out after a woman he had killed. Those were not gaps in the system he slipped through. They were powers the system had placed in his hands on the simple assumption that a man who had risen so high could be trusted to hold them. The mask did not just buy him cover. It came with a key ring. That is the thread running beneath this whole video. We are trained to fear the stranger, the outsider, the figure at the dark edge of things. But the most dangerous person is very often the one standing in the most light. The devoted father, the church elder, the officer in command. Not because trust itself is a mistake a society cannot run without it, but because trust by its very nature is the one thing we agree to stop examining. And every so often someone builds an entire respectable life for precisely that reason, so that no one ever will. Russell Williams pleaded guilty to all of it and was sentenced to life with no possibility of parole for 25 years. The judge said the depths of depravity he had shown had no equal. The wreckage spread far past the courtroom. The town of Tweed, where neighbors had waved at the friendly colonel with a cottage, would never feel quite safe again. His wife, who said she too had been deceived, divorced him and was pursued in lawsuits by his victims and their families. And an entire institution had to absorb the fact that it had pinned its medals on a predator and handed him the keys to a base. The military then did something it almost never does. It formally stripped him, revoked his commission, and burned his uniform and his medals, scrubbing his name from its records as if to deny he had ever worn the cloth at all. He admitted in court that he had betrayed his family, his colleagues, and his country. But the last word should belong to the women, not the colonel. Marie-France Comeau was a member of the forces he led, killed by the officer she had every reason on earth to trust. Jessica Lloyd was a young woman with her whole life still ahead of her, taken from a community that believed it was safe. They were killed by the one kind of monster almost no one is ever taught to watch. For not the stranger in the dark, but the man at the front of the room in the good uniform. The one we had all already agreed to trust. 3 men, 3 circles of trust, a family, a town, a country, and each time the same lesson, sharpening as it goes. The door we never think to lock is the one we opened ourselves and held wide for the person we were most certain we could trust. 3 men, a model father, a church council president, a decorated colonel. The kind of men you would hand your house key, your children, your safety, and every one of them used exactly that. The trust itself as the place to hide. That is the uncomfortable thread under all 3 stories. We picture danger as a stranger in the dark, someone who looks wrong, someone at the edge of things. But the most effective disguise a predator can wear is respectability, because trust is, by definition, the thing we agree to stop checking. The more a man looks the part, the less anyone looks behind it. List wore the mask so well he simply rebuilt it in a new town. Rader wore it so well his own pastor had to be told 3 times. Williams wore it so well a nation handed him the keys. This isn't a case for trusting no one. A life like that isn't worth living. And the overwhelming majority of people who look decent are exactly that. The point is smaller and stranger. It is that the very things we lean on to vouch for a person, the family, the church, the uniform, are the same things. A careful monster can hide inside precisely because we have agreed. They mean someone is safe. And in each of these cases, the thing that hid him is what finally gave him away: a face on a television screen, a disc traced back to a church, a search the killer himself sent out. So, when something feels a little too trusted to question, sit with that discomfort 1 second longer than feels polite. The most dangerous person in the room is rarely the one who looks it. I'm Johnson. Thank you for spending this time with me. I'll see you on the next one.